Yes.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do my opening intro, and we'll start at 8 o'clock. So if you want to get a quick drink or something and do whatever, I'll be ready to start in about 10 minutes or so. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce this and get started. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to see you all again. I have to make a little confession. I am less than 24 hours back from England, and I spent enough time there traveling around Dover Castle and Chartwell and all places like that that I just noticed that it's 1 o'clock in the morning for me when I'm doing this interview. It may be 8 o'clock here, but it's 1 o'clock in the morning still body time, and I haven't had my first sleep to go through this, so I am counting on an aggressive and stimulating interface with Scott tonight to ensure that I don't drift off in the middle of an answer. So if you see the thing going, I've lost it, and somebody say, Len, wake up, and we'll go from there. But it really was a good trip. I enjoyed it a great deal. Scott, what I'm kind of interested in you is how's your foot doing now? Is it coming along?
It's coming along. I was just at physical therapy yesterday, and I was kind of griping a little bit just at the progress, and he was saying, no, it's really a 6 month to 1 year to really get back to where you're at. I'll say the last week I've made some progress. I tried to get out and do a little too much walking too soon, I think, but I'm feeling some progress. I'm getting a lot of numbness in it now, so it's starting to work its way out. So, and they started this week to be a little bit more aggressive in the physical therapy, which they don't want all those muscles and things that they cut through and sewed back together. They don't want you to tear them again.
Do too much.
Yeah.
For those of you who aren't familiar with what I was asking Scott about, this program that we're doing on George Washington, Scott was originally going to do it in early April, and about a month or so ago, he had surgery on his foot, and about a month or so ago, Scott came back to me and asked and said, this is not healing quite as fast as I thought or hoped it would. Can we push back a little bit? And we took a look and pushed his program from April to July, in hopes that extra 3 months would give Scott enough time to more fully recover, so that he can be mobile out in the field, because these spots are certainly going to require some mobility to get in and around there. So it's his feet are of great concern to me and to y'all as well. And so I just wanted to check on that. Couple of other administrative announcements concerning tonight. As you all who have been with us before, and those of you who haven't been with us before, we're delighted to have you in what is ostensibly a conversation between Scott and myself about George Washington in the French and Indian War. And we have looked at a manner of getting through this. We've agreed on some questions and so forth that will script us through the period that we're going to be covering. And then we're hopeful that if we have 10 minutes or so at the end of the program, that we'll be able to integrate any questions you may have into the program. Now, what our experience has been in the past is that people tend to want to ask questions as Scott is talking. What we've ended up doing with that is you'll notice in the Zoom program up in either in the lower corner or the upper corner, if you look at it, you'll see a chat button. You'll also see a button that you can raise your hand. What you need to understand, so that we don't look like buffoons as we go through this interview, is that both Scott and I will see any remarks or questions you ask. It will temporarily flash up on our screen. That can be distracting. So while I welcome questions, I'll moderate when they come in, and we'll decide if and how the question will be asked. Because of that, what I ask you to do, out of respect for Scott and I trying to keep this on track and getting through what we want to get through for you, is don't chat between yourselves on the line, because you talk to, I see Andy and Bill. If Andy and Bill decide they want to, hey, Andy, how you doing? Good to see you. Going to the program. We'll see all that, and that will interrupt us and so forth. So out of courtesy, it's like not whispering in a lecture when the person is talking. It can just be distracting. So I ask you not to do that for us. And then in return, I will do my very best. We'll answer as many questions as they are. What we have done for a year and a half now is basically keep this within about 1 hour to 1 hour and 5 minutes. And the way I do that is last question to Scott is generally asked between 5 minutes to 9 and 9 o'clock. He gets to answer that. And then I say, fare thee well. And then anybody who didn't get a question answered, who really wants to do it, if Scott doesn't have to run to the restroom right away, then we may keep up the chat room another 5 minutes or 10 minutes or so to take those other questions if you have to ask them. And if Scott can't stay for whatever reason, then we'll sign off, and then I'll give you an email to send me your question, and we'll get it to Scott, and Scott will answer it, I'm sure, by email after the event. But that's pretty much how
I'm free afterwards. So whatever if we run over some, I'm available.
Okay. But out of respect to Karen, who hosts us, and everybody else, regardless of what we do, we'll finish this program by 10 after 9, unless there's a really active discussion, and then it'd be quarter after 9. Otherwise, 9 o'clock, and we're not offended if you have to go somewhere at 9 o'clock. There's TV shows to watch and so forth. So we don't get too upset about that. Couple of quick things for you, as I pointed out before, because there are some new people on the tour here, or on this Zoom presentation. The first thing is that we've been doing these now for 15 months, and we have about 37 of them online. Karen's really swift on this, and she'll probably fairly quickly show you where you can find these on YouTube. They're open, and we'll have this one posted as well on there, and we will have that up within usually less than a week. And you've got, as you can see here, you have got a whole panoply of subjects, historians, and talks that you can focus in on and get a whole lot of great information from that. They are up. Access is free. We've got 316 subscribers. Subscribing is free. Welcome you to do that. While we're looking at that, I would also point out to you that Blue and Gray is a project that our host, Karen Needles, is our contractor on. We have put online for BGS members 337 lectures going back to 1994. They include Ed Bars and any number of people. We've got 75 more to put up, and then we'll start looking at some of our field studies and stuff. But people who are active members of Blue and Gray at the $75 level or more are allowed unlimited access to those for the entire year of their membership, and then they renew, they get continued access to it and stuff. Scroll up just a little bit, Karen, and show them where the membership button is for that. If you're not a member, you can find on our website, just right up there, membership, join BGS or renew your membership. And then once I get that, then I'll send you a hot link to sign in and so forth that will make that work for you. Like I say, it works for a lot of people who no longer can do the fields and stuff. There's a lot of great information out there, and we certainly welcome you to join Blue and Gray and to access these archives. And then last but not least, and then we'll get into the program, I would point out to you that our host, Karen Needles, has been working for some 25 years on this project, which is a wonderful, wonderful archive that has been that is free access to everybody. Just is marvelous things, such as she scanned all the records of the trials of the. What do we have here? This was the Provost Marshal's group. She just got any number of wonderful options there that you can see. There's the Dakota Wars, which was 1862, has all the trial cases. Show one of the trial cases. It's reported there that all of the trials, this was resulted in the largest mass execution in U.S. history. 38 or 39 Indians were hanged simultaneously right after Christmas in 1862. And there's other just beautiful things like this in and around that Karen has scanned in there. Jefferson Davis, his trial, all of that stuff. Things like that are just really cool to look at. And she's got lectures, all sorts of other stuff to look on there. Suffice it to say, look at lincolnarchives.org and you will find endless amounts to amuse yourself and to educate you. I make this pitch, and I'm sorry to say not as many people do it as I asked to do it, but Karen doesn't get any money for this at all, but she got to pay bills too. And her business is working in the National Archives. And for 2 years and a month, or 2 years and 3 months, the archives have been closed to researchers and people like her. And she would certainly appreciate anybody who can make a donation and would like to make a donation to what she's doing, because she got bills to pay like everybody else. So, and she's got to update this as well, because the technology has changed, and she's got to get some new software and stuff to keep this thing viable. So with that, I ran a little bit long in my intro, but I wanted you to know those things because some of you are new to us, and I wanted you to be aware of that. So once again, Scott, thanks very much for joining us. Scott Patchan, of course, is a well-known historian. Most people know him for his tremendous work in the Shenandoah Valley. And not surprisingly, this program and this discussion night starts in the Shenandoah Valley as well. But he's also a Revolutionary War historian and also a historian of the Atlanta campaign as well. So really delighted to have the opportunity to probe this portion of Scott's intellectual interests, and to welcome him on board yet again for what we're doing. So with that, Scott, I'd like to open up and say, for the folks out there, if you take a look at our schedule this year, we're doing three programs on George Washington that feature George Washington. And this one seems to be a really great opportunity to look at the experiences that George Washington had in his young life before he becomes more famous for his Revolutionary War exploits. Scott, who is George Washington in 1752, and why should anybody care?
You know, George Washington, 1752, is an ambitious young man. Most of his experience at that point in time had come in his late teens as a surveyor. He's only 20 years old in 1752, but he's very ambitious. But he's the youngest son in his family, and his older brother Lawrence has already inherited everything. And it's incredible when you read Washington's writings and things, the drive that he had to accumulate land. And he's going to be doing that, laying claims out as he's already amassing land as a surveyor, and making connections with Lord Fairfax and others in there. But it's just what I see at that point is just that drive. People would probably, the average American today would probably look at that in such a young man and think of it as being somewhat coming across as greedy and everything, and with our modern culture and things. But it's when you look at his family, they came to Virginia. The Washingtons in England had kind of seen their highest star when they left, and when his great grandfather came here, he settled 5,000 acres along Little Hunting Creek that would include the land that we now know as Mount Vernon. So Washington has these ambitions in terms of wealth, land, but he also wants to be an officer in the British Army. That's one of his goals in his life at this place. So he's a very directed man, but I think he's in many ways very immature, and we're going to see how things play out during this campaign. He's a young officer, he's inexperienced, and he's going to have setbacks. And to me, the most interesting part of Washington here is not necessarily that he did not succeed, because you have, which we'll get into later, but you take a young man out there and put him into these circumstances, there's certain things that he will do well, and which his experiences and what his primary asset that he has in 1752 is going to be the knowledge of the land in what is now a lot of West Virginia, Western Maryland, Southwestern Pennsylvania, where he has actually been out there and done surveying work. So those elements are going to serve him well, but there'll be other things that you're really going to look at him throughout the French and Indian War and come away with the feeling that, boy, at some point between 1758 and 1776, this guy went back and looked at everything, not just the outcomes from a military perspective, but he gave what I would call a hard look at himself and how he reacted, because there's no way that the young man of the 1750s could have achieved the success that he did during the Revolutionary War and beyond as the father of our country, without a high degree of introspection and self-improvement, and definitely a large dose of maturity.
Something that's really fascinating to me, and I was reminded of it as I looked at Chartwell, and I've been to Blenheim Palace and so forth in England. What I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate is the traditions that came to the new world from the old world. And of course, I think you've touched on it there with they used to call it primogeniture, in which everything went to the oldest son. So if your father had 5 kids and he had an oldest son, the son inherited the plant or inherited the estate. He inherited the title that went with it if there was a title. He inherited all the wealth and so forth. And if you were the second, third, or fourth son or daughter, you might get a dowry if you were a girl to carry you, to convince a man to marry you. Or if you were a young man, you had to figure out something else to do, because dad was going to give you some money. But at the end of the day, when dad passed on, your son was going to move into the big house, or the oldest son was going to move into the big house, and everybody else was going to be dependent on whether or not the big brother liked him very much.
Exactly. And that was young Washington realizing that he was that youngest son, and he had to make his way and set his lot in life. And if he wanted that, he had to go out and take it for himself.
It's fascinating, especially if you're like number 2 or 3 and you believe you're smarter than your older brother, which I'm number 1. I'm the oldest in my family, and I have 4 brothers and a sister, and of course I was smarter than any of them, and they always tried to knock me off. But what my brothers and sister have done has been very, very impressive in their own right, and I see the same sort of thing with young Mr. Washington. He's not the oldest son, and although he eventually gets the farm, it's no foregone conclusion that he would. He just happens to luck into it. Having said that, a younger Washington, I think you touched on this a bit, but I'd like you to maybe explore it a little further. Does the 20-year-old Washington have a mentor or a life stream that is clearly discernible?
Well, he's kind of closest in his family to his older brother, half brother Lawrence, a different mother than George. And his older brother had served in the British Royal Navy, and was an officer and had seen some action. And George really respected that and looked up to him. And Lawrence was the guy that had Mount Vernon. Well, Lawrence would be the one who actually named it Mount Vernon there. Lawrence and his other older brother, Augustine, were both members of the influential Ohio Company as well. And so they're going to be tight with the leadership in Virginia. The Ohio Company was essentially set up by Virginians and for the settlement of the Ohio country, which was essentially everything along the banks of the Ohio River up to the Great Lakes. And so that's going to be one of the large reasons why young George is going to get pulled in to some of this that's going on. But he would be very close to Lawrence, and when Lawrence was suffering sick, he would go down to the Caribbean, and he would spend time there with him. And it's there that Washington would be inoculated himself against disease. But Lawrence would ultimately die in 1752. But the estate's going to be with his wife, and it's not clear that it's going to be George's at that point. Washington, as a young man, he's also, as a surveyor, he's out there in the Shenandoah Valley with the Lord Fairfax out there in Greenway, or what's now White Post in the Shenandoah Valley. And he's been in the man's office. He's been out surveying the millions of acres that Lord Fairfax owned out there. Basically, all lands in Virginia were the northern reaches of it anyway were under his control, and if you wanted land, you had to go through him. And so that was a very influential perspective as well for Washington. Washington's brother Lawrence was also adjutant general of the Virginia militia, and he would, in that connection, would allow him to have the governor appoint him later on as the major of Culpeper County militia, which doesn't mean all that much, but it positions Washington for things as the events that lead up to the French and Indian War as to how he ends up with a military command. But you're seeing there, young George, from his older brother's connections, he's going to be pulling on them. So I'd definitely call him the closest person to him in his life would be his older brother Lawrence, and look out for him. And
I think something else that you said that really is worth reinforcing is that any of you who are familiar with Virginia will know that Fort Belvoir was the ancestral estate of Lord Fairfax, and you're right. Fairfax had the ear of King George II, and to have been placed as the king's representative in the Virginia territory was a huge patronage job. If you needed to know anybody and you wanted to be anybody in the New World, you had to get along with Lord Fairfax, because Fairfax could make you or break you. He could favor you or he could turn his back from you. And that, I think, is really significant to know. So, and keep that in mind, because I think as we go through this, Scott is going to touch on some other things that I think are going to help us understand Washington a bit better. Thinking about the program we're going to do and stuff, could you briefly outline the issue or issues that will bring on the French and Indian War? Tell us about the contested areas in North America and elsewhere, and how you got to those areas from the Virginia colony, and the role maybe that the Indians played on both sides. So just kind of a thumbnail on how the French and Indian War got to be in North America.
Well, let's go back here to the late 1600s. So you're going to have three wars between the French and the British in North America. What's going to be different about what we call the French and Indian War and these other one happened in the tail end of the 1600s, the other in the 1710s, and the third one ended in 1748. Those wars were all the outgrowth of European conflict. It's like mom and dad were fighting over in Europe, so the children here in North America picked up in there. And out of the second one that ended in 17 teens, the French believed that gave them the right to the Ohio country. And they never really promptly moved on it. You know, the populations were so small at that point in time. One thing, I just a little back up here and talk a little bit. Now, the British are land hungry. The British are going to be growing immensely in population. The British want land for settling, farms, you know, growth, towns. They want to continue the rapid expanse westward of European civilization in North America. The French had a different philosophy on this. Now, in the early, about 1754, when the war breaks out, there's about 75,000 French settlers in New France. There's well over 1 million already in the British colonies, just to give you there. And so the French are looking to establish and do trading and trapping, trading with the Native Americans, and the British are always cutting deals with the Native Americans and, you know, stretching them and basically ripping them off for their land so they can take it to settle. You'll see some of this, especially up in Pennsylvania here. But so that's the difference in the two philosophies. But after the Second French and Indian War ends in 1748, the British have the Ohio Company, which has the royal imprimatur of King George II. There's other initiatives to settle that territory for the English out there as well, but the Ohio Company, formed by the Virginians, which include both of his brothers who were on the board of directors of that for Washington, that's the main one. That's the one that's really going to start moving and shaking. And so the British initially start expanding out into this Ohio country through trade. And the British have superior products in terms of blankets, clothing, beads, weaponry, and things to trade with the Native Americans out there. And so they're literally moving out, and they have some trading posts out there as far as Pickawillany in modern day state of Ohio. And the Indians right away noticed, hey, they're getting good deals on these trades. They're getting superior quality goods than in larger quantities than what the French were providing. And so right away, the British, are making inroads with the French allies and client Indian tribes in the Ohio country. And so they don't like that. In 1752, there was a raid at the Longlade's raid, who was a French officer, and he led a number of French allied Indians from farther up in the Midwest down into Ohio to Pickawillany and massacred the Indians that were there, drove off the British traders. There was only one chief. Most of the warriors had been out on the hunt at the time, and they killed the chief and boiled his heart and ate it there as a warning to all the other Indians not to trade with the British. The British would also send out, the French would send out a party and they would bury lead plates at various points, marking their claim, kind of an old European tradition. We've marked this claim, it's ours, land does not belong to the British. So that's going to continue with the tension. Now, the Indians had thought that the British would provide them more support when the French started cracking down on that. But Britain was fighting, the colonies were in no position to resist the French. The cost of the previous war and the lack of willingness to go right back to war with France just was not there in London. So, some of the colonies did a little bit, but for the most part, they forced a lot of the British traders out of the Ohio country and, back into farther back into central Pennsylvania. In 1753, the French are going to start building forts down from Erie, Pennsylvania. There'll be a fort in Erie, Fort Presque Isle in Erie, Fort LeBoeuf, and Fort Venango, coming down the Allegheny River towards modern day Pittsburgh. And when we're out there on the tour, I'm going to be referring a lot to the Forks of the Ohio, which is what all Pittsburgh was at the day. It's where the Monongahela came in from the south and the Allegheny came in from the north to form what we call the Ohio River, or La Belle Rivière, as the French called it back in the 1750s. So they start moving southward down in there. And right away, the English, in particular, the Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie, the official governor of Virginia, never came to Virginia. So Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie was calling the shots at this point. He gets alarmed at this, and he's going to send a diplomatic mission out there to northwest Pennsylvania with a letter, a warning to the French. And this is late 1753 that this mission will take place. And who is he going to pick? Young George Washington. Why? Largely because of his experience as a surveyor in some of this area. And, he was a well-respected man from a well-respected family, recommended. And so he's going to get this. He's going to meet up with another explorer who knows the area quite well, named Christopher Gist. And with a party, them and a small party of Native Americans, they're going to head north in December. And then they'll reach Fort Venango, which was essentially a British trading post that the French had kicked the British traders out and occupied as a small outpost. And then they'd move up to the next fort, Fort LeBoeuf. And it was there Washington's going to arrive, and he's going to learn that the captain in command there, and by the way, the French at this point in the war, captain was the highest ranking officer that you could have. So he said, nope, I'm not the senior in command. He'll be down in a few days. So he comes down, and basically the British take his message, and Washington's going to be very observant. He starts looking around. He's counting the number of canoes and very intelligently is making some notes on this stuff. He's basically spying on the French there, noting that it looks, hey, they're going to be making a big move down the river based on the number of canoes and other transport that he saw there at the fort on the Allegheny. So obviously, the French are going to pay no regard to Governor Dinwiddie's demand that they get off the King of England's land and return north to Canada. They feel just as strongly as the English do that that is their land. This is French territory. And so Washington is going to return back to Williamsburg, Virginia. He'll arrive there in early January and give the news. Well, at that point, Governor Dinwiddie, going to send out a small detachment under a couple of officers to build a fort at the forks of the Ohio. Young Washington, and it's really interesting how Washington plays this. He wants command of the Virginia regiment that's going to be formed, and he doesn't want high command, but he wants to be the lieutenant colonel. And he's writing to several influential Virginians. He was saying, I recognize I'm not ready to be the colonel, but under a properly experienced officer, I would do quite well as the lieutenant colonel. And so Washington's major role is going to be getting this regiment organized. And most of these men are going to be recruited from the streets of Alexandria, Virginia. Dinwiddie's going to round up a couple companies of men from Tidewater and send them up to Alexandria. But young Washington, as the lieutenant colonel, his mission is going to be to head out through the Shenandoah Valley and reinforce that small force that by March of 1754 is starting to build a small fort at the forks of the Ohio. Now, the French are going to come down in overwhelming numbers and overwhelm that force. At the threat of force, they're going to force that small company of English out of the forks, and they will proceed to build the large Fort Duquesne, which will become the focus of the British actions in the early part of the French and Indian War. Now, Washington, he's out there, and he's getting some really aggressive messages from Governor Dinwiddie. Governor Dinwiddie's telling him, hey, if anybody's messing with British subjects or taking our land, you may kill or capture them. Very emphasized. And Dinwiddie makes this clear in his letters to other influential Virginians at the time. So Dinwiddie has taken Washington, who would be 22 years old in 1754, and you're given this aggressive young man with absolutely no military experience, with orders, that he can kill or capture the French. And the French have already dispossessed and attacked one small force at the Forks in March of 1754. So Washington's kind of already feeling, hey, he's there. But the rest of his regiment is still behind him. The colonel is going to fall off of his horse and die in Cumberland, Maryland, and will never get them. So Washington, by default, is going to become the commander of this force. In late May, he's out there in the area around what's now Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and up in the mountains just to the east of there, where Fort Necessity is located. And that's where things are going to really start developing for him. But
I was going to say it leads very well into probably the first big controversy of George Washington's military career, which are the events surrounding Jumonville. And I was wondering if you might comment a little bit on the incident with Jumonville and the subsequent affair at Fort Necessity.
Well, Jumonville is out there as, in the end, they're going to say he's on a diplomatic mission, just like Washington was when he went up to see the French commanders, and that he was ordered to tell the British to get off of the French lands and go back to Virginia.
So who's Jumonville? Why is he out there?
He is out there. He's got a company of 35 French soldiers, French Marines, essentially. And they are a detachment of the Fort Duquesne, and they've been sent out there. And oftentimes what gets looked over there is Jumonville is out there with kind of a dual-edged mission. Yes, he has a message to deliver. But one of the things that's interesting, if you look at his orders in particular, his commander, Contrecoeur, has told him, if you find the English, report back to me and let me know where they are before you take any action. So he's out there, and his troops have destroyed the settlement of Christopher Gist, not far from Fort Necessity. It'll be we'll visit the site where that was located at. And so Washington knows they're around. There's also, at this point in time, this is going to come into play, and is a very important element, is the Iroquois Indians out there. The Iroquois are in control. They're the top dogs out there in the Ohio country. However, they are not necessarily there in force. They're in, upstate and western New York is where their center of gravity is for where they control. But because they've defeated the Shawnee and Delaware and other Indians in previous wars, all of those tribes are forced to make sure that they stay in good stead with whatever they're doing, that it's approved by the Iroquois League. And there was an Indian by the name of Tanacreson. He's also known as the Half King. And he's out there, and one of the things that Washington's supposed to be doing there is trying to get as many of the native tribes to join the British side. He's supposed to be trying to sway them over. And so late May 28th of 1754, late at night, Washington's going to get word from the Half King that they've located this marauding band of Frenchmen, and they're hiding. It's a really neat site that we'll visit there. It's called today Jumonville Glen, and he will lead them to this. Washington will take about 40 men with him, and with about a dozen Native American troops under the Half King. They will go, and in the early morning hours of the next day, they will surround this. Some of Washington's men will be up on a cliff. The others will be covering hillsides, and the native troops would be coming up the other side, the only open area where the French could escape. And they would open fire on the French. And it's a controversy. Washington would always insist that the French guards fired first. It seems unlikely the way the whole situation developed, and also from testimony, not only from the French, but also from some of the Native Americans that talked about the episode there. One Native American actually said Washington fired the first gun himself personally that morning. Be that as it may, the situation quickly gets out of Washington's control, and the Indians the French try and escape, and they're running down this ravine, and then the Half King leads his troops up and attacks them, gets in among the French, and just starts hacking away at them. And one of them, the commander, Lieutenant Jumonville, the fighting will have stopped, and the Half King will go up to Jumonville and basically crack open his skull, rip out his brain, and squish it in his hands right there in front of Washington, who's never been in any military action of the sort. And it's just, he loses control of the situation before they can stop. And there's 13 of the 35 French are going to be massacred at that point before Washington and his men can regain control of the situation there. But it's going to be that incident there that would later write British historian Horace Walpole to write that the young Washington set the world on fire in the backwoods of America. I'm not sure at that point that Washington realized, that he basically has started right there a world war. That would be fought Asia, Europe, North America, Africa. So I don't think he fully realizes the significance of it. They'll take back a number of prisoners and send them off to Williamsburg. One of the French will escape and will report what happened back to the commander at Fort Duquesne. Now, that fort would soon be reinforced by another French officer who was the half brother of Lieutenant Jumonville. And he would be assigned the task of seeking revenge and going out to deal with Washington and whose forces then fallen back to the area of Fort Necessity. And so by early July, this large French force is essentially going to fight Washington, surround him, and it starts raining. The French are low on ammunition. The British have taken very heavy losses in the day's fight. They'll lose, about 100 out of 350 to 400 men killed and wounded. So Washington kind of leaps at this opportunity, and the French, in very traditional European format, and more so because they're running out of ammunition, and so they agree to let Washington march away. Turn over some of he has to destroy his swivel guns that he had with him, but essentially he gets to march away if he signs this document of surrender. And it's been raining, and he has a Dutch officer, von Braun, who does the interpretation from the French to English for Washington. And in this document, what was overlooked at the time, or at least Washington claimed that it wasn't there at the time, but I think it was more or less Washington wanted just to get the heck out of there, but was an admission, and it probably overlooked the severity of it, but the assassination of Ensign Jumonville. So Washington signs this document, and then that blows up and becomes an international incident that leads to an expansion of the French and Indian War. The French will start sending over additional troops, and Washington will fall back to Cumberland. He'll be back in Virginia, and he will no longer be a regimental commander after that. He's kind of disgraced at that point. When we're out there at this point, there's a lot of times during this whole campaign where Washington's immaturity, again, the failures, I think we as people who love history can look at that and say, inexperienced guy, you see it happening. But the things where you really see the later growth in Washington is there's a captain brings 100 troops. They came up from South Carolina. They were British regulars from Charleston under the command of a Captain McKay. Well, a captain in the British military regular army establishment ranks a colonel and lieutenant colonel in the Virginia regiments established under the purview of the British colony of Virginia. Washington didn't like that. And Washington kind of gets in this habit of writing back to Dinwiddie over several things that occur and basically saying, you got to get this fixed or I'm quitting and going home. And that's going to be a recurring theme here. And, so that will continue throughout the war there.
Yeah, let me, just as a point of clarification, Brian Burney rightfully chastised me for making a leap too quick. From the point of Jumonville's murder to the point in which Washington is forced to surrender at Fort Necessity, I might have led you all to believe that Fort Necessity was in existence at the time of the Jumonville murder. It wasn't. In fact, Washington had selected the location for Fort Necessity, which again showed his inexperience, and subsequent to the event had built Fort Necessity in a bowl down below, in which preordained what would happen if he ever was laid siege, and that did in fact happen.
Right. But
What
keep in mind, though, that Fort Necessities was not constructed with an eye to being a defensive location. It was kind of a stopping point. One of the things that Washington was doing and working on between the French attack in early July and the Jumonville incident at the end of May is he's working in improving roads. There's supposed to be a couple of regiments coming to reinforce him, and he's trying to be the vanguard for the push to drive the French out of Fort Duquesne. He's working over towards what's modern day Brownsville, Pennsylvania. They call it Fort Redstone for Redstone Creek, but it was a blockhouse where there were supplies that the Ohio Company had been storing there. And so he's actually out well west of Fort Necessity. And he runs into a problem with the regulars where they refuse to do any of the manual labor. And so the Virginians are doing all of the work. And so he believes, that, there's North Carolinians, New Yorkers, and Marylanders that are coming out here, and there's going to be a large force, and that he isn't necessarily going to be the man in overall charge of it, but their ultimate goal. And that's all going to be dashed when the Contrecoeur sends out the party to go after him. So he falls back to the great, what was more referred to as the Great Meadows at the time, and probably becomes Fort Necessity later. The Half King and his small contingent of Native American allies took one look at the so-called Fort Necessity and called it that little thing in the meadow. And they decided that they knew the French, and they looked at Washington's force and the inexperience of that force and the small size of it. And they took off and they left him there with no allies.
Yeah. What I want to do is we have about 20 minutes left. And what I want to do is I want to vector this into two areas because it's a compare and contrast. And you've set this up. You made mention that, of course, Washington is very concerned about his relative authority, even as a lieutenant colonel or a colonel, relative to the regular British establishment. If time permits, I'll make a parenthetical comment about that on my own knowledge of the British system later on. But what I'd like to do in this last segment is I'd like you to compare and contrast the Braddock expedition, Washington's role in that, and the Forbes expedition, which follows the Braddock expedition. If you could tell us a little bit about both of them, and what does Washington accomplish in both of these events?
Okay. Well, Washington, it's not clear that he's going to have a role in the Braddock expedition there. And so he ends up getting, because of his experience and knowledge out there, getting a staff position on the staff of Braddock and helping him out, sharing his knowledge with General Braddock and things, and sometimes, assuming he knew more than he did in there. But once they actually get out there in the expedition, Washington's going to be very sick, and he's going to be riding in wagons, and on the day of the battle, he's going to get on a horse and catch up at the very end. And I think that history has kind of greatly exaggerated Washington's role as fighting a rearguard action and greatly exaggerated that. He would be a calm presence there after Braddock is wounded and help with the retreat. And when Braddock would die, he would say the prayers from the Book of Common Prayer over his grave, and ensure that where they buried him in the middle of the road right before the rest of the army marched over it. So because if the Native Americans found the grave, they would desecrate the body. And so did that, and he went back. And so after that, he's going to earn himself the commission as the colonel of the Virginia Regiment again. Fortunately, there's going to be a lot of time in between there and the 1758 Forbes expedition where his immaturity, he's just always threatening to resign. His force was at Fort Cumberland a lot, which was in Maryland. And well, there were Maryland officers and they were asserting authority there. So that was always something that was bothering him, that he had to be subservient to these Marylanders things. So he would go on. He wanted Forbes, when Forbes comes out there, he's trying to convince Forbes to take the same route that Braddock took up there. And, Washington had a high opinion of himself, and he had gone to see Governor Shirley in Philadelphia to try and convince him of the path of war, and was promptly kind of like, who is this guy and what does he want? He got the meeting because he convinced Governor Dinwiddie up there, but to see the British commander-in-chief. So he's going to be there as commander of the Virginia regiments. His most noted action is going to occur near Fort Ligonier, and there's going to be a raid from the French and Indians out towards that area. And in the nighttime engagement, Washington's most notable thing is going to be a friendly fire incident between his and Colonel Mercer's Virginia regiments there. The whole Forbes expedition, while successful, and it's successful because when Forbes was moving on Fort Duquesne, there were also things going on up in New York that were cutting the British. The British were cutting into the supply lines that made Fort Duquesne untenable. Actually, in the biggest battle there, Forbes would send out Major James Grant, who would later be a general during the Revolutionary War in the British Army. He would command and defeated.
Grant would command the Boston Concord expedition in April of 76.
And he would be serving in that army as well in 77. But anyway, Grant's going to get his hat handed to him and lose several hundred men in an expedition when they moved out to kind of go see what was going on at Fort Duquesne. When then within a couple months after that, the French, because of the pressure of Forbes' approach and actions farther to the north that impacted their logistics, were pulling out and destroying Fort Duquesne, and then the British marched in and occupied it. So I think one of the differences is Braddock was a large solo force moving out into the Virginia wilderness, but in 1758, 3 years later, Forbes had supporting activities that were impacting the French elsewhere as well, that would limit their ability to hold on to Fort Duquesne.
So. Something I found interesting, and of course, I was stationed in England back in 1981 to 1984, and I've subsequently had a running relationship with the people at Sandhurst and elsewhere on the British history and British military history. And my godson was a British Army officer in the Queen's Own Regiment who was wounded in the Afghanistan War. And what I noticed, and I think it's important because the British Army has been a traditional army for hundreds of years, and the manner in which it was done. Now, when my nephew was was going through Sandhurst, within the army itself, you have the Queen's regiments, the household division, like the Coldstream Guards, the Grenadier Guards, the Blues and Royals, those units that are combat units, but also have a royal requirement, and they're part of the Queen's own personal guard. And so when you go through Sandhurst, the big element of this, even 250 years after this, is who is hand selected to serve in the Queen's regiments and who goes to the peripheral regiments, such as, the 29th Infantry and so forth, or 29th Foot. And what Washington is looking for is that recognition of his prominence and prestige in the colonies to be selected to be a regular British officer, because even a regular British captain is senior to a militia colonel. And Washington, who is, as you mentioned very astutely, very ambitious, wants the recognition that comes from getting the scarlet tunic. And he never gets it. He never gets that recognition that he is somebody who has served the crown and consequently would be a crown officer. And Douglas Southall Freeman says it bothers him all of his life, and it animates him even through these other generations. So I think it's very fascinating to see the points that you recognize when he goes back after the Fort Necessity surrender, discredited, and does a very good job of rehabilitating his reputation, but still finds himself not necessarily respected or accepted by the British leadership in the Forbes expedition and so forth. So certainly something that will stay with Washington a long time. When the war ends, Washington goes back to Mount Vernon, and I think there's some interesting things come out of that. But I was wondering if you might tell us what struck you most about Washington and his activities after the French and Indian War. What's he do, and where does he fit into this picture?
Once again, he leaves a few years before the war. He leaves right after the Forbes expedition, and largely, he's going to marry Martha Custis, and Mount Vernon is now going to be officially his. So he's going to leave that. He had been smitten with Sally Fairfax, the wife of the Lord George William Fairfax.
Very risky thing to do.
Belvoir. And it's really, if you read some of the letters that he writes to her, boy, he was dancing.
Yeah, let's hope Lord Fairfax never read them.
But it's and anytime after, whether it was after Fort Necessity or after Braddock's expedition, he's coming back and going to visit her and tell her about his adventures and how much he can't wait to see her. You can see, I think that's the woman he loved. I think his relationship with Martha was one of, they kind of got together, and it was a love that grew over time, but she was certainly brought the wealth that he was seeking. But that essentially, he's going to leave there and go back to develop Mount Vernon and become the man that we all know as the father of our country. There,
PJ Sessoms, that's the trouble we get. We let people in here early when we're talking about things and stuff. He spotted those slides. Why don't we've got a few minutes. Why don't you just run quickly and run through your slides real quick and just show them. And just make a few comments to each one and see if we can get through slides in about 5 minutes or so.
Okay. All right. So what we've got here is essentially the map of the area that we're going to be touring. So we're going to start off down in Winchester, Virginia, and we're going to follow up over the mountains and go up through West Virginia, cross the Potomac River at Old Town, where Old Town, Maryland, on a one-lane wooden bridge that's recently been rebuilt. And right there is where Washington would camp on his way up the Fort Necessity. He'd move on to Cumberland, and we'll be there at the Fort Ohio, which was really, again, an Ohio company blockhouse, and where he would later be part of the development and troops that would be manning Fort Cumberland. Quite frequently, his troops would be out there, the Virginia Regiment, but Washington, because of his dislike of the situation with a certain Maryland officer who was officially in command there that Washington felt he should rank because it was Washington's troops, Washington would spend a lot of time down in Winchester. And this would be the period after the Braddock Road. But we'll make a couple stops along the Braddock Road, Little Meadows, the Great Crossing, Fort Necessity, and Gist Camp. We're also gonna, on the morning, we're gonna head out to Brownsville, to the site of the Fort Redstone. That's where Washington was working to get to when the British Revenge mission comes out, and he has to pull back to Great Meadows or Fort Necessity. And then we'll head up to visit Fort Duquesne, Fort Pitt site, and the Braddock's Battlefield Visitor Center, and we'll go out to some of the one surviving sites that at one of the most open areas. A lot of this area has been completely decimated by the Braddock Works of the United States Steel, but there's some old ball fields from where some high schools were at, where there's a statue of George Washington near the visitor center. And so we'll go down there and talk about the actions from that perspective. And then we'll head out to Fort Ligonier. Fort Ligonier, it's the friendly fire incident out there, but the museum there is tremendous. They've got a couple of the George Washington's saddle pistols from the Revolutionary War, just some of the artifacts they have in there. It's just incredible. And the artillery displays of period artillery at Fort Ligonier, and telling the story of Forbes' campaign as well. From there, we'll head back down through Bedford, and planning to have dinner at Jean Benet Tavern. That would be established shortly after this time frame. So it's a very old stone restaurant that was a tavern. Sits right next to the Pennsylvania Turnpike today. And then we'll head back down for the final day of the tour to Winchester. And we're going to get outside of Winchester, and we're going to go out to some of the surviving forts. A lot of things that they called a fort in the French and Indian War was actually, a stone house. It was, they see they built a stockade around it, and anytime the French and Indians would raid the area, everybody in the neighborhood would go to these. So there's several nice areas there. We're going to go to Fort Loudoun. The remains, it was a massive fort north of Winchester that Washington oversaw the construction and was personally involved in there. And you can see a lot of that, the foundations of that in the northern part of Winchester. So we will be there. So that's kind of a little summary of what we'll be doing on the tour there. This right here is a diorama depiction of the defense of Fort Necessity by Washington and his men. You can see there, it's a rainy, muddy day. The wounded are being taken inside. They had earthworks that were filled with water. Some of the men where they didn't have earthworks, you can see over there towards the right-hand side, they're like in a creek bed taking shelter. And the French have essentially blocked them in there. And they're penned down, and that's going to lead Washington to retreat, to agree to surrender, and then retreat back to Virginia. This is just another vision of the diorama. This of the French and Indians in the woods on the hillsides there, where they were firing down into the fort. The British had not cleared enough, and so the French and Indians were able to utilize the shelter of the trees in the woods and still be within rifle range or musket range of the fort. This is artist Griffin's rendition of Washington, leading his troops forward. Out here in the front, the troops in the front, those are the British regulars under Captain McKay. Washington's men are in the back row. A couple companies have uniforms, but you look on the flanks, they do not. They're just dressed in ordinary civilian garb. One of the things is it was said that many of the men joined Washington's regiments here just to get a decent set of clothes on their backs. And Washington would struggle to supply these troops, even before he left Alexandria, Virginia.
Just a quick point before she goes off this, you see the British officer in the front and so forth. Even today, you've seen the British Army with the bearskin hats and so forth. If you're in the Queen's Regiment, your uniform generally costs between $5,000 and $10,000 today, and you have to pay it. You're expected. Before then, you used to buy your commissions. You'd buy your rank. But in those days, as gentlemen, you were expected to provide all your own stuff. The uniforms for the enlisted were provided, but if you were an officer, you were very well turned out. And like I say, even today, the uniforms of a British officer in the Household Guard today run about $5,000 to $10,000, depending on which regiment they're in.
Okay. All right, this is a slide, a photograph of Chemonville Glen. And you can see up there above those rock cliffs, some of Washington's men were up there firing down onto the French who were basically camped up in that area. It was rainy, and they had their tents set up there, and it was Washington would later argue that they were sneaking around and hiding out in the woods, so that they were up to something once he realized the magnitude of his error that had brought on there. One of the things after this skirmish is that Washington would write home, and this would get back to the King of England, King George II. And Washington talked about how charming the bullets sounded as they whistled through the air. And the king brusquely said, well, if he'd had more than just a few bullets whistling around, he might not think that it was a very charming thing after all, as taking a poke at his lack of experience. And this is my first, one of the things for me becoming a historian was coming out here in 1972 as a 6-year-old. But I distinctly remember the reenactor there. He had just fired that, and I asked him, I said, can I hold it? He said, yes, but don't touch the metal barrel. It's hot. And that. As a side note, I was disappointed that although George Washington was there, he was with the Redcoats, because I wanted to see Washington in a blue coat. So when I saw these photographs of him wearing red, I kind of went sideways. But I did get the souvenir tricorn hat from the visitor center on the way out, though. So yeah.
Let me offer one comment as we wrap this up. Look at this picture, and then Karen, go back one, please. Look at this scene. What's missing there are people. That's the reason that you ought to be going to this. This is such important American history. It's forgotten by so many people, and yet the sites are there and they continue to speak to us. And going out and sitting in that presence is extraordinarily important. And Scott, I'm really delighted that you have taken the time to put this program together for us. We've never done it before, almost 28 years. And this is the first time that we've ever ventured out into this stuff. I've done Forbes before, but I've never done this before.
Yeah, and
we're
I'm
really looking
excited
forward
to do this because it's I really focus a lot on Washington out here, organizing this regiment, moving the troops out there logistically. I mean, there's a lot of things that I think he learned a lot from, and he's going to call upon this in the Revolutionary War. But that's why we're going to put a heavy emphasis on things where Washington was the guy calling the shots, and looking at Washington's role and how he reacts to these things in there. I'm working on a book for the History Press that focuses on Washington as an officer in the French and Indian War. It's a little guide to the sites that are out there in that area as well. I'm wrapping that up here in the next couple of months. But I think it has kind of become a little bit generally, let's blame Washington for starting the French and Indian War because of the Jumonville thing. And I'm really big, when I really look at the correspondence coming out from Dinwiddie, and Dinwiddie's a guy that he was hot to settle this land. He was hot to get the French pushed out of there. I think Dinwiddie, to a large extent, knew he had an aggressive, young, inexperienced commander, and he gives him those orders to kill or capture anyone that has molested the British subjects in the area, or, so I think Washington, after the small British contingent at the forks of the Ohio had been driven off by this overwhelming force, Washington felt, I think, that was certainly within the bounds of his mission. There was to, engage and capture or kill these British, that's what the order stated, and that's exactly what he ends up doing at Jumonville.
Let's wrap up on this. Best book for somebody to read to prep for this program.
I can say undoubtedly David Preston's book on Braddock's expedition came out 4 or 5 years ago. I'd put that at the top of the list. He does a good job covering the whole thing. So I would put that at the top of the list.
Well, great. Hey, Scott, as I promised folks, since I took 5 minutes of your time, we took 1 hour and 3 minutes. We're finished, and unless anybody's got a burning question stuff, we're going to call this a night.
Okay. I was just going to just real quick. I was just going to go through the chats. So he did pick the spot where Fort Necessity was, but again, it wasn't necessarily when that spot was picked with a view. It was picked because it was an open meadow where they could supply, feed the horses and the cattle they had with them. And it just so happened that when that large French fort comes on the side there, I'm just going through, we looked at the slides, see if there's anything else.
Yeah,
Okay.
I took them all in.
Oh, you did? Okay. All right. Well, thank you
when
all.
You're a good
It's going to be a great time. This is a beautiful time of the year out there in that area. It's one of the side benefits, Len, of switching from early April to July. We're out there in the time frame that Braddock's expedition takes place. The Fort Necessity battles in July, so it's there. Side note: there's a nice winery out there and a distillery. Maybe we'll find a little time to hit those up there. I actually bought a fifth of Half King whiskey that was distilled up there. So,
did you drink it all though?
No, I have not yet. I'm waiting for my son to come home here in a couple of weeks from Texas, so I tend to share those special bottles.
Absolutely.
So,
well, Scott, thanks very much. Thank you all for joining us tonight. The registration's up online. Look forward to seeing you join us. Thanks so much for joining us, and tell your friends and talk to you next week with Gary Eckelbarger. Have a great night.
All righty. Take care.
Thanks, you too, Scott. Thank you. Thanks, Karen.